Some of these strips of wood are extra pieces from various projects, and others I cut specifically for these boards. And then I take all the different types of wood, and I try not to overthink this, but I try to randomly place it in a random order. I set the two clamps on the table, and then I put all the strips of wood on the clamps for the glue up process. I use Type-On 3 because it's waterproof, and it also has a longer open time, which means it takes more time to set up when gluing a bunch of strips together, so the first couple strips won't start drying before I get to finish clamping it up. And I use a glue roller to make sure to spread all the glue out evenly. These clamps are Bessie clamps, and I really like them, and I use the two on the bottom, then I put one the other direction, because if I just do the ones on the bottom, sometimes the boards bow up. And I scrape as much extra glue off as possible because I think it's easier to scrape it off before it dries. Then I usually let it dry for 3 to 4 hours, sometimes overnight, and then I take the clamps off and I scrape any extra glue with the chisel, mainly around where the clamps were. The reason for this is because I want it to sit as flat as possible when I run them through the planer. I always put the side down that was against the clamps on the bottom because the different strips sometimes were different thicknesses, so the ones that were setting against the clamps, that is the flattest side. It usually takes about 8 to 10 passes, and in between each pass I flip it over to try to get each board as flat as possible. The planer I am using is a 20-inch Grizzly planer, and I am super glad I bought this thing. I've used this a ton and it works great. Once I get them flat, I take them over to my 6-inch Powermatic jointer, and this is to get a straight edge to make sure it sits against my table saw sled. I trim the one side to get a starting point, and then I use a stop block because I want each of these strips to be exactly the same. Now I cut these strips at 1 3/4 because the finished cutting board is going to be 1.5 inches thick, and I need an extra 1/4 inch to give room for planing later. Now I have a bunch of different strips, and I select a few from each pile to get the most random design possible. Sometimes there's a little bit of chip out from the table saw, so I take each piece and send each side through the jointer to get it nice and smooth. I realize I call these random design cutting boards, but I try to rearrange the strips to not have a bunch of groups of the same wood together. I use my router to route a chamfer on the edge. This is to prevent chip out because sending end grain through the planer, if you don't do this, it most likely will chip out, and this helps prevent that. This is a very simple planer sled I made. It's simply a piece of MDF with a strip of MDF screwed on the back, and I use hot glue to secure the board down just so it doesn't move. The purpose of the planer sled is because the bottom of the cutting board isn't exactly always flat after the glue up, so since the planer sled is flat, then it will make the top side flat. Now I simply pop the board off with a chisel, and since the top side's flat, I can put that against and get the other side flat. I apologize if I said flat too much, but it is very important to me that this cutting board is flat. Now I use the jointer to get one straight edge, and I use my table saw sled to cut the board to size. I have markings on my table saw sled at 13 inches and 17 inches because I make a lot of cutting boards 13 by 17. To start the sanding process, I use my drum sander with 80 grit, and each pass I flip the board over to try to get the most even sand possible. I use a belt sander with 120 grit to get rid of the drum sander marks, and then I use an orbital sander with 80 grit. Now it might sound counterintuitive to go back to 80 grit with the orbital sander, but I always found that this works best from going from the belt sander to the orbital sander. I always prefer to put a chamfer on my boards versus a roundover. That's just my personal preference. Then I start with the corners and then go around and do the edges. This is an adjustable juice groove jig I made because I do different size cutting boards sometimes, and it's nice to just have one jig for all different size cutting boards. I've learned that sometimes it's better to lift the router in the corners because if I spend too much time in the corner, then it will leave burn marks. I do the juice groove in 2 passes so it's not as hard on my router and it's easier so I won't make any mistakes. This is also a jig I made to route the handle grooves, and I also do this in 2 passes for the same reason. I made this block so all my juice grooves and handle grooves are the same depth. I just adjust my router bit to the size of the block and make them all the same. Then I use a sanding block to sand the edges with 120, and I also have a block I made to sand the juice grooves with 120. Then I use my orbital sander also with 120. Before the final sand, I spray water on the boards. This is called raising the grain, and it keeps the board smooth over its lifetime, especially cutting boards, because cutting boards will get washed and dried, so this will raise the grain and then the final sand will make it smooth. I heat my branding iron with a propane torch and I burn my logo on all my boards. For the final sand, I use 220 grit. I use cutting board oil and the company is walrus oil, and this is the best part to see how the final boards turn out. And since these boards are end grain, it soaks up the oil a little more, so I make sure to put it plenty on. I let the oil soak in overnight, then I take a clean towel and wipe off any extra oil. Now these boards are ready to ship. If you watch the full video, I appreciate it, and I'm giving away these coasters for free. All you need to do is comment in the comments what project I should do next. Thanks for watching.